Okay, everyone. Welcome to another social emotional workshop. Today we have Avalon Healing Center, and they're going to be talking about sexual assault. Bonita, it is so glad, we are so glad to have you. You can go ahead and get started in your presentation.
Thank you so much, Toni. I appreciate you for inviting me, and hello to everyone. Good afternoon. I'm assuming everyone's in Metro Detroit on this snowy day Toni and I were just talking about. For the next 45 minutes to an hour, I definitely want to feed you all with some knowledge and information about not only some of the work that we do at Avalon Healing Center, but also just sort of foundational materials on the topic of sexual assault. So I want to start off by saying that, I know that folks may have questions related to the materials and related to your specific work. So feel free to enter those in the chat, and I'll definitely address those in real time, but also at the end, leave some time for folks to just kind of unmute and ask questions as well. So I am going to share my screen now. And let me just put this in slide mode and get you all. So again, my name is Bonita Robinson. I am the Director of Crisis Services and Education with Avalon Healing Center. We have been working with Toni for, I think it's been probably about 2 years now, doing some informational sessions on basically sexual assault and human trafficking. You probably have heard one of my colleagues speak in the past. So this is, again, very foundational. We, just for your information, we do offer higher level trainings. For those of you who are interested in learning more and exploring more, feel free to reach out to us. I'll provide my contact information at the end, as well as share more information about our organization toward the end, because I do want you all to also recognize that we are a resource. This is the work that we do. And so as you all are encountering survivors that you're looking for resources or connecting them with services, we are an organization that you can definitely refer folks to. So our objectives for today, we have 6 listed here. And again, we only have less than an hour, so we're going to definitely go very briefly through each of these. First, we're going to start off defining sexual assault and kind of talk about some examples that fall under that umbrella. We're going to define consent and coercion, which are 2 key terms that are very vital to understanding the issue of sexual assault as a whole. We're going to look at a few statistics. There's tons of data out there about sexual violence. We're going to look at some very baseline statistics to kind of give you an idea of the prevalence of sexual violence, discuss reasons why survivors don't disclose their experiences. This is a really, really important piece because there's often a question of why survivors don't report or tell someone after they've experienced sexual violence. So we're going to dive into that. We'll talk about ways that you all can support survivors of sexual violence, and then end with talking about our services through Avalon Healing Center. So this is just so for your knowledge, our theory of change around education and outreach work that we do. So we believe as an organization that providing education to the community not only increases awareness, but also improves survivors' experiences with the systems that they engage in. And so this is a really important aspect of our programming, because not only do we talk to community members that work in various organizations and across disciplines, we also train people who have direct interaction with sexual assault survivors after their experiences, such as law enforcement, medical entities, maybe even mental health organizations, right? And so the point of all of this is to increase awareness, but also drive individuals to learn more about how they can support survivors in an empathetic and helpful way. So of course, today we're going to be talking about a topic that's very sensitive in nature. We always want to warn individuals that although today we're not going super in depth, the topic at hand by nature is a sensitive one. So feel free to jump on and off camera if you need to. Take care of yourself. And again, I will provide my contact information in case anyone wants to talk afterwards or has some follow-up questions that maybe you don't want to ask in front of the group. Oops, my apologies. So we're going to start off with that first description in the objective around what sexual assault is. And so this is a very basic definition of sexual assault that I think, anyone at any level can understand, right? And so sexual assault is basically any form of sexual contact or behavior that occurs without explicit consent. When we talk about sexual assault as a term, the term sexual assault is an umbrella term. And so oftentimes when people hear terms like rape or molestation, they think that encompasses sort of the act of sexual assault. As you can see on the screen though, sexual assault includes multiple behaviors beyond rape and molestation, right? So for example, unwanted fondling or touching, forcing a person to engage in pornography or other forms of sexual acts against their will. Something else that I don't have on here that I've been talking about a lot more is sexual violence facilitated through technology. And for those of you that work with students, for example, this is a huge one that we're seeing coming up with not only just teenagers, although it's very prevalent with new users of social media, for example, but also all the way into adulthood. And so, for example, if someone shares a photograph or a video of someone where, for example, they were naked or had limited clothing on, right, body parts exposed, that wouldn't normally be exposed to the public in that way, that is a form of sexual violence, right? And so now that this field is emerging more and more, talking about how sexual harassment and sexual violence can happen through means of social media and other technology, I think it's important to recognize that by nature, sexual assault usually is associated with direct contact with a person. But there's also forms out there where you don't have to physically touch an individual to inflict sexual violence upon them. And so that example of technology kind of demonstrates how that can happen. Legally, sexual harassment is not under the definition of sexual assault. It's actually treated separately, but I always put this under our definition because sexual assault does not happen in a bubble, right? There's usually some actions or acts that happen, behaviors that are problematic that happen that result in the acts occurring. And so I always want to make sure that we're making that connection as well, that sexual harassment by nature is creating a hostile environment, for example, making sexually explicit jokes or comments that may make an individual uncomfortable, right? And so we have to recognize that usually sexual assault just doesn't happen without some of these acts sort of building up and leading up to that point. So the last piece that I have on this slide is talking about coercion, and we're actually going to get to that piece in a second. But remembering that sexual assault is not always violent. And when I say violent, the crime of sexual assault is a violent crime, right? It's a harm to an individual, but it's not always facilitated by a weapon or physical force, right? And so we're going to dive into coercion a little bit because that sort of describes actually the majority of experiences of sexual violence. And that's kind of contrary to what a lot of people may believe. Any questions so far? I don't see anything in the chat yet. So if not, I will continue on.
Benita, would
Yes.
sex station, where they're extorting over the phone over pictures and whatnot, would that come under this umbrella?
Yes, it does. So sextortion is a popular term that we're hearing now, and it actually is. So I know that you all heard a couple of months, well, actually last month, I think it was December, from one of my colleagues, Meredith, and she talked about human trafficking for those of you who were here for that session. And so sometimes it can fall under that category. Human sex trafficking is a form of sexual violence. And so it's not like they're two different and very separate topic areas. But sextortion is a kind of a branch of what I described earlier, using technology. So I mentioned a description of like someone releasing a photo or video without consent. A lot of times that's used as an act of, for example, blackmail, threatening, or forcing an individual to comply. And so that is sort of the description of sextortion, right? And so that actually is going to come up in a second again too. I didn't put the exact term sextortion in here, but those examples of how people can use non-physical force to make a person comply with what they want, and that still falls under sexual assault. Thank you for that question. So next, we're going to talk about consent briefly, and consent is foundational to the definition of sexual assault. When we think about sexual assault in the definition, sexual assault happens because consent is absent, right? And so if there was an agreement or consent involved, right, then that would be what we would consider, right, a act that both parties are willingly engaging in, right? And so when we talk about consent, right, a very basic definition of consent related to this topic is an agreement between participants to engage in sexual activity. I do want to say that consent is much broader than the conversation of sexual violence, right? Because we think of consent, right, in this field as relating to sexual acts and behaviors. But one of the things that we often talk about and promote is how we can teach consent to, for example, children at a very young age around non-sexual activity, right? And this is how you kind of build up that knowledge, even with children, around what consent looks like when they do get to the age of like engaging in or potentially engaging in sexual activities. And so here we're talking about sexual activities, but I want you all to also expand your thought around that and think about how we teach and talk about consent to little ones who aren't at a place to have this particular conversation, right? So do we allow children to decide who touches them in non-sexual ways like hugs? We think about, you know, in friendships, we consent to engage with our friends or not in various ways all the time, right? Do you want to hang out this weekend or not with them, right? So we're always sort of making agreements and negotiating what type of activities we want to participate in. When we talk about sexual assault specifically, right, we're being more intentional about saying that you are in a dynamic where, or, you know, expressing a dynamic to your partner that is voluntary, that's clear and freely given, meaning that it's not happening under the guise of pressure or manipulation or threats, right? That both people know what they're getting into and are volunteering and agreeing to participate, right? Recognizing that those cues are verbal and nonverbal. So oftentimes we hear when we're talking about sexual violence that people say, well, the person didn't say no, right? But we know that the majority of communication actually happens through body language and nonverbal cues. And so we definitely have to pay attention to both of those when we're talking about consent. Recognizing that it can be revoked, right? A person can change their mind at any time. A person can agree to certain acts and not others, right? So this debunks that myth that like once you say yes, you can't say no, or that, you know, if a person, for example, consents to kissing, they're consenting to everything that follows, right? It's very activity specific in that way. And so, you know, this is the way that we definitely need to start having these conversations and talking about consent. Some circumstances in which consent cannot be given. So obviously, if a person is intoxicated, right, when we think about the examples or definitions, example definitions of consent that I gave a second ago, right, when you're intoxicated, you are not in a mindset to fully weigh the pros and cons of making a decision, right? Obviously, intoxication of drugs or alcohol impairs your ability to sometimes make decisions or engage in certain activities. And so legally, right, if a person is drunk or high off of a substance, they are able to consent to sexual acts. Obviously, age is a huge dynamic, right? So folks who are underage or below the age of consent. So in the state of Michigan, the age of consent is 16 years old, right? What does that mean? That does not mean a 16-year-old can engage in sexual acts with a 30-year-old, right? It means that they can legally engage or consent to sexual acts with the person up to the age of 18 years old. And so after that, right, obviously the person is an adult, and there's other repercussions around like engaging with underage individuals. But below the age of 16, although all of us on this call know that unfortunately youth are engaging in sexual acts, especially without any type of knowledge or training or education around it before the age of 16, this is sort of what the legal standing is. And that's something that differs state by state. Asleep or unconscious for any reason, similar to intoxication. Obviously, if you're not awake, you can't consent to be able to say yes or no or give those nonverbal cues. And then unequal power dynamics. So when we think about, for example, a school setting, an example of an unequal power dynamic would be a student and teacher, right? If we think about some workplaces, an employer or employee, we can also think about, for example, people with mental health challenges or who are developmentally delayed, for example, who maybe are in a situation with a person who is able to understand and fully comprehend what's going on versus a person who isn't or doesn't have the capabilities to do that. And so there's many examples, but those are some examples of where unequal power dynamics can come into play, where an individual either feels like they can't say no because of the authority of the other individual, or maybe are agreeing to something and really doesn't have the capability to fully understand what they're agreeing to. So moving on to the next term that we kind of talked about a second ago, coercion. So I actually gave some examples of this as we were talking about the definition of sexual assault and consent. Coercion is basically any force or unwanted sexual activity that happens without physical force, right? So when we think about non-physical force, right, the example I gave earlier is use of technology. We see that so much nowadays, it's very, very scary, right? Where someone who, for example, you were previously engaged in an intimate relationship, maybe you share photos or videos, and then later they may use that against you and say, if you don't do what I want, I'm gonna release these photos on social media or airdrop them, or right, all of these ways that you can reach thousands and thousands of people by, at the touch of a button. And so that's a huge example. In our program, we're seeing social media, dating sites, and technology being used more and more to manipulate, stalk individuals, harass individuals, right, and share personal information. And so we definitely are encouraging more individuals, especially in school settings that are working with youth, to talk more about social media safety. I definitely, when I'm talking to teenagers, for example, I promote bodily autonomy. That's definitely a priority for me. But I also say, you have to make wise decisions, right? About, for example, sharing photos of yourself or videos of yourself with someone who at the moment you feel like, this is a trustworthy person. But usually we all know, like, the person you're with in your teenage years, more likely than not, is not going to be the person you're with forever, right? And these are things that you can't get back once you share. So with coercion, technology is the hugest example that I can give of that. But there's other examples, right? Pressuring someone, guilt tripping a person, manipulating them, maybe giving them false information to force them to comply, threatening them, right? Forms of oppression. We see often that with coercion, right? We talked earlier about the intoxication piece, that sometimes drugs and alcohol is used as a tool to force a person into complying without the physical piece, right? And so we don't see as much of date rape drugging anymore. Actually, in this opioid crisis we're in, right? A lot of people are using prescription medications. Alcohol is a huge, probably the number one facilitator of drug/alcohol facilitated sexual assaults. And so again, another area that we definitely need to talk about more around, like, safe drinking, and sort of the repercussions of drinking alcohol and what type of safety concerns might come up after intoxication. And then, of course, power dynamics, right? I gave some examples of those earlier, where, for example, teacher-student relationship, they could use their authority to force an individual to comply without even putting a hand on them, right? So we're gonna get now into talking about the scope of the problem. And when I introduce statistics, I always say that we have to definitely take them with a grain of salt, because with sexual violence in particular, this is a hugely underreported crime. And so some of the statistics that are out there are based on reported crimes. Some of them are estimates based off of what we know about sexual violence and how it happens in communities. And so, we haven't seen really too many changes in the statistics. I mean, I've been doing this work for over 10 years, and the statistics have pretty much remained pretty consistent around the prevalence and frequency of sexual violence. But just always remember that, we can never say that it's 100% accurate, just because of the fact that a lot of people don't report. And so how do you actually know the full scope of a problem without having that true picture of how many people are impacted? But despite that, the numbers are still very horrific and horrifying. Most estimates say about 1 in 6 or 1 in 5 women and 1 in 33 men have been victimized by attempted or completed rape. So earlier I mentioned sexual assault as an umbrella term. Rape specifically means that there was some sort of penetration or attempted penetration, right? And so that's a pretty large number if we think about the number of women and men across our country. Now we're looking kind of at those are youth under 18, 1 in 9 girls and 1 in 53 boys under the age of 18 have experienced sexual assault or abuse at the hands of an adult. In actuality, most sexual assaults of individuals under 18 are at the hands of an adult, although we do see sort of crimes against, youth on youth sexual assaults. It's very much more so prevalent that it would be an adult perpetrator. 2 to 3 cases under the age of 18 are between that 12 and 17 age bracket. So we see even, obviously there's some vulnerabilities around age, but then even more so within that 12 to 17 category. Unfortunately, in addition to that, there's a gender dynamic, right, where most of the survivors of sexual violence are women and girls. And so although we see an uptick of sexual assault against boys, men, and folks who identify with other gender identities, still by and far, women and girls are mostly the ones that are victimized by this issue. Females ages 16 to 19 are 4 times more likely than the general population to experience actually all forms of sexual violence. I have a few listed here, but in literally every category. So rape, attempted rape, stalking, sexual harassment, human trafficking. This age group, probably all the way up to the age of like from 16 to 21, are most vulnerable to all forms of sexual violence. And so I think that's something that we need to pay special attention to and make it, and definitely consider what interventions we need to consider as we're working with this population, right? This is really unfortunate to see, because before people even reach adulthood, they've experienced this level of trauma. And a lot of times it goes unresolved, right? They don't get help, even if they do disclose, or maybe they don't disclose and keep it in. And one way or another, right, these issues come out across their lifespan. And so that's, I think, really, really disturbing as well. Majority of sexual assaults occur in a trusted location, so home, school, at a loved one's house, right? Kind of debunks the myth of like the stranger in the bushes type dynamic that we still hear to this day, that people are really in locations that they should feel safe. About 75% of rapes go unreported to law enforcement. So I talked about that a second ago. This crime is hugely underreported. 8 out of 10 perpetrators are known in adult cases and 9 out of 10 in child cases. So most of the time it's not a stranger, I don't know. I know that I grew up on this like stranger danger dynamic, like, which is important to teach children how to engage with strangers. But unfortunately, sometimes the monster is people in your social circle that should be trusted, right? And so we have to think about that also as we're having conversations with our youth as well. Any questions or comments before I move on to the next section? Okay. So some of these I've addressed already, so I won't go through each and every one, but unfortunately, sexual assault has been a major issue for years and years and years in our community. And in more recent years, it's becoming more visible. It's not like it hasn't been happening, it's just becoming more visible, right? So we're seeing more publicized stories about sexual violence on the news and in the media, right? And people having more open conversations about it. But oftentimes I'm asked, why does sexual assault happen? Like, how has it thrived in our community for so long without it being treated as serious as some of the other very harmful crimes, right, that are inflicted on individuals, right? So these are some myths that we've seen over time that have really created problems with some individuals and communities and disciplines taking this issue seriously. And so, a huge part of educating people on the issue of sexual violence is making sure that they understand the falsehoods that are being spread about sexual violence in order to recognize it as a true problem that's really impacting our communities in a negative way and has been for years. And so one huge myth that I still hear today is that most disclosures of sexual violence is false, right? So we have this idea that people who come forward and say that they've been sexually assaulted are lying. Statistics have shown, and the trends have remained the same over years, at least the past 10 years of me being in this field, that false reporting lingers between 5 and 8%, right? And that's countrywide. So most of the people who are reporting experiences of sexual violence are telling the truth. It doesn't matter that they told years later or that they're suing someone and trying to get monetary gain after experiencing sexual assault. Like, these are all of the things that people say that says, well, they must be lying because they're suing the person and they're trying to get money, or they waited years to tell, or maybe they didn't tell the story in a chronological order that makes sense, right? All of these sort of narratives that are pointed to. Despite all of those things, whatever reasons that people come forward or whenever they come forward, statistics are still showing that most of those incidents are actually true experiences of sexual assault. I want to address the one that talks about like this only happens to certain kinds of women. And what that means, that kind of has a few different myths built into it, right? So you hear, ideas of like, there's sort of this idea of the perfect victim, right? And so when a person falls outside of that category, it's like you're unable to be sexually assaulted. So for example, right, kind of connecting to our previous presentation around human trafficking, there are some individuals who engage in sex work, for example, because their options are limited around survival. And people feel like those individuals don't have autonomy to say no. Like, they are individuals who can't be sexually assaulted, right? Or even people that are more promiscuous, have multiple partners, right? All of these sort of stereotypes that are people view as negative that may make people believe, well, how were they actually assaulted? And so we know that everyone should have the right to say no, no matter what the circumstances are. And once a person says no or demonstrates that they're not actively engaged, that falls under sexual assault. This statement also sort of puts out a myth that only women are sexually assaulted. So although earlier we talked about the fact that it is mostly women and girls, we have to also have the conversation about sexual violence with men, boys, and folks who identify in other gender categories. And those are conversations that are still not happening as frequently. And so, it sort of discourages, for example, men and boys and other individuals from coming forward and talking about their experiences if it's automatically discredited according to their gender, right? The last one that I'll talk about is men who sexually assault boys are gay. And this is one that I often get a lot of questions about and comments about, right? So the thing that I didn't mention in the original definition of sexual assault is that sexual violence is really about power and control. It's not about the actual sexual act, right? And so when we think about the power and control dynamic, we remove the sexual act piece of it, right? Exerting power over an individual, forcing them to do something that they don't want to do, right? Demonstrating a person's authority over them through that compliance, right? This act has nothing to do with the person's sexuality, right? And sometimes that's hard for people to understand because inherently, we usually think like, oh, if you're having sex with a person who's of the same sex or gender, then, right, you must identify as gay. And that's not always true. A lot of times it's very situational. A lot of times it's really about, again, being able to control that person in a way that exerts power over that individual. So the next thing we're going to get into is talking about barriers to reporting and disclosing. So earlier we talked about that really huge number of individuals that don't disclose their experiences with sexual violence. I want to kind of talk a little bit about why that is and what we see through our program and other programs having common experiences with survivors around why they indicate that they don't want to talk about what happened or don't feel safe doing so. So this is not an exhaustive list, but some examples, right? So we'll go through some of these and I'll kind of group a few of them together. Victim blaming is always at the top of my list, right? Because when we think about, for example, some of those myths that come up that were on the previous slide, but also that we just hear, right? What were you wearing? What were you doing? Well, if you weren't living this certain lifestyle, maybe that wouldn't have happened, right? Victim blaming at its core is shifting the accountability from the perpetrator to the victim. So it sends the message that the person who was victimized could have done something differently to prevent themselves from being sexually assaulted, right? And when you explain it that way, that's really problematic because for any other victim of crime, people don't normally say, and we may hear it here and there, but there's not a standard per se of saying that you could have done A, B, and C and this wouldn't have happened to you, right? And so this is huge because a lot of times when survivors come to us and say, well, maybe I tried to tell a family member and they said, well, why were you at that party in the first place? Or, we often see, for example, runaway teens who left the home, right? Ran away from home after they ran away, they were sexually assaulted. And sometimes parents will say, well, if you didn't run away from home, you wouldn't have been sexually assaulted, right? And so that's a very problematic perspective because people who engage in certain activities or acts are not doing so because they're asking to be raped or sexually assaulted, right? And so we have to be able to separate those things out, even when there's some sort of problematic behavior. For example, a teen running away from home, right? That's a behavior that needs to be addressed. We have to separate that out from if they were victimized after running away from home, right? And sort of address what led them to do that, but not have that conversation lead to like, well, you could have prevented being sexually assaulted, right? Because the fact of the matter is the accountability should only be on the perpetrator, the person who inflicted that harm on that individual. Fear is a huge reason, right? So I have a few different types of fear. Fear of not being believed, fearing that nothing will happen. Unfortunately, the criminal justice system is not known for prosecuting a large number of perpetrators of sexual violence. And so this is one reason why a lot of times people are like, I don't want to go to law enforcement. They're not going to go to jail. Nothing's going to happen anyway. Fear of retaliation. So if they were threatened, or even if they weren't threatened, right, they may still have some sort of fear of a threat of violence or an infliction of harm on themselves or someone that they love. We often see some more internal reasons as well. So sort of like the shame, guilt, self-blame. So sometimes people internalize those external messages that they're hearing about sexual assault, and they may themselves feel guilty or feel like, you know, if I wouldn't have been doing this, then maybe this wouldn't have happened, right? And so oftentimes when we're talking about supporting survivors, we always use that language of this isn't your fault, you didn't ask for this, this isn't something that should have happened to you. Experiences of trauma symptoms. So today I don't have time to go deeply into trauma, but what I will say about trauma in relation to sexual assault is that, like any other form of trauma, right? Other traumatic experiences, for example, could be getting in a car accident or being, you know, and fleeing from a war-torn country. Natural disasters, right, can result in trauma. Right, just being in a violent community, right, being in a community that is impoverished and there's a lot of violence within that community, right? We can go on and on, right? But one of the things that trauma does to individuals, specifically around sexual assault, is there's a loss of psychological safety a lot of times, right? So feeling like, you know, you can trust the individuals around you, feeling like you are able to make decisions for yourself that are sound decisions. So a lot of times people have this this sort of questioning process that they go through on, like feeling like, okay, maybe I should do this. No, I should do that, right? This indecisiveness because, and this is sort of associated with the self-blame, like feeling like I made decisions that might have caused my own harm, right? And so trauma symptoms are really huge. I think a lot of people who expect certain things out of survivors don't recognize that trauma can cause them to be cautious about making decisions. So that may go along with reporting. It may cause them to not remember what happened to them in a very sort of linear way. So oftentimes we ask survivors, tell us what happened from A to Z and make sure you include every detail. Trauma affects your memory and your ability to process information. And so, you know, oftentimes we translate that as this person looks like they're making it up as they go along or they're lying, when actually the trauma that they've experienced actually impacts their brain. So we in this field do a lot of studying around neurobiology of trauma and how trauma impacts the brain and trauma symptoms. And so those are some things that we definitely have to take seriously when we're engaging with trauma survivors. Lack of education, lack of support. I see a little typo in my PowerPoint, but lack of support and access to resources, right? So a lot of times people don't know what sexual assault is. We have a lot of survivors that question, like, you know, they feel like something problematic happened, but they're not sure. They may feel like they're overreacting, right? So education around that piece, but also around how to connect with survivors and make the environment that you're in safe enough for them to feel like they can disclose, right? We have a lot of disciplines that unfortunately work with trauma survivors or sexual assault survivors that don't have any training in sexual violence. And so although they're encountering these dynamics, they just don't know what to do when someone discloses to them. Thinking about generational cultural and social norms, this is like a huge interest area of mine because, you know, sexual violence doesn't look the same in every community. And I often use my own community, Black community, as an example of this, right? So when we think about generational trauma, I'm sure some of you may have heard this saying in your households, like what happens in this house stays in this house, right? Those dynamics that sexual violence is a personal matter that should be handled within the household, right? And so what happens when you kind of perpetuate that learning system throughout generations is that people feel that there isn't going to be accountability, because oftentimes when you say what happens in this house stays in this house, that means you're not reporting to law enforcement, you're not seeking out therapeutic services, right? It's kind of a mentality of like, suck it up and move on oftentimes, right? It's not actually handled within the household. And so you have people maybe who are perpetrators in the family that are still showing up to family dinners on Sundays, they're still showing up to the family reunion. And it's just like, you know, people know that they're problematic. They're kind of like, yeah, we know not to, don't let your children sit on their lap. Don't let them be alone with this person. But is that person really held accountable, right? And that's just one example that we can talk about many, many more, where unfortunately sort of those cultural teachings or generational teachings, norms within a particular community or culture can sometimes, although it was positive for us at one point, right? Now it's not actually a good tactic, right? To have that sort of teaching within the family. And then also a commitment to family and community. So protecting the perpetrator because they are a part of your family, or maybe if they're outed, it would bring shame on the family, right? Oftentimes, if you know a perpetrator, there is some sort of, or was or currently is some sort of loving relationship. And so some survivors won't say anything because they don't want to ruin that person's life, which is weird for some people that aren't in that situation to think about, because a lot of times people are like, well, why would you want to protect someone that harmed you in that way? And so we have to realize that relationships are complex. Even when an individual inflicts harm on that person, they may still feel that obligation to protect them. Before I get to this part, any questions or comments on that last section, barriers to reporting? Okay. So as we come toward a close and talking about how we can support survivors of sexual assault, the main thing that I want to say before I get into some strategies is that whether you know it or not, you're interfacing with survivors of sexual violence, whether they disclose to you or not, right? We saw earlier the statistics and the frequency of prevalence of sexual violence. I think it's important for us to know that we always have to communicate with people and come from a lens of, we don't know what people have been through or what they're experiencing, right? And so I'm saying that to say that we definitely have to be sensitive to what we say and how we show up in the world, right? So the reason I say that, for example, is that oftentimes when I see a public case of sexual violence on TV or in the media, and for most people in my community know what I do, right? I've been doing this work for a long time. But for example, if I'm in a social circle where people don't quite know that I work with sexual assault survivors, they may start saying things that are super problematic, like, you know, well, this person waited 20 years to come out and say something. They just want money. They're just a clout chaser, like, you know. And when you think about that, what if a person who's experienced sexual assault is sitting in that circle, right, and hearing that language being used? You can be harming an individual by sort of talking about these things in that way without even knowing it. And so I often tell people that to do this work and engage with sexual assault survivors and any type of survivors of trauma, you also have to look inward and kind of think about what your biases are and do some more intentional learning, right? And I think we all are on that journey of doing that every day. Even for me, who's been doing this work for a long time, it's always about considering, like, what can I do better to support survivors that I don't know about and don't see, right? Because I think we're often trained on working with survivors that come to us, talk to us, right? You want to create a dynamic where you're a safe person for someone to come and tell. And in that situation, if that's the way you kind of frame something that you see publicly or on social media, that individual is definitely not coming to you and disclosing their own experiences with sexual assault, right? And so I'm saying that to say we just have to be very, very mindful of how we engage in these conversations. So here are some ways to combat sexual assault and support survivors. The first thing I want to say is making sure that you know your role and staying in your lane, right? So if you're not trained to, for example, be a therapist or a counselor around this issue, I know a lot of folks who work in the school setting, for example, are and I've worked with a lot of counselors across the state, and a lot of times they tell me we're trained in behavioral related issues. We're not trained in trauma focused issues, right? And so knowing that and recognizing that, right, you want to make sure that you have at least a basic knowledge of the language to use with them, but then have that resource to be able to refer them to someone that's more appropriate to work with them. We all don't have to know everything. This is why we have collaborative working relationships. We have resources in the community. And so recognizing that if you're not trained to work with trauma survivors more intensely, it's okay to just say, hey, I want to refer you to this program that's better suited to work with you and help you with these issues. So letting survivors know it's not their fault and that you believe them. Sometimes when they're disclosing, they will talk about their own self-blame. They will say, you know, I shouldn't have done this, or, you know, other people are maybe using harmful language with them, victim blaming. And so you want to be the person that sort of presents to them as a positive individual and not one that's being negative towards their disclosure. And so recognizing that, especially if you're the first person that they disclose to, oftentimes your reaction will shape what decision that they make next, right? If they disclose to another individual or even report to law enforcement. And so you want to be cognizant of that. I know that a lot of folks are working with youth, and so obviously as mandated reporters, we should definitely be transparent and let folks know if we have to report what they're disclosing. But outside of that, right, if an adult, for example, discloses to you, then making sure that they recognize that you believe them, that you're there to support them, and not forcing them into making decisions, right, which sometimes we do without even recognizing it. Making sure that we're placing the accountability on perpetrators and not victims, communicating with intimate partners and not assuming consent. So this is something that you can do in your own personal lives, right? I talked about this a second ago, is kind of watching your language and making sure that you're engaging in these conversations in a meaningful way so that it doesn't harm individuals that's around you. I am a huge proponent of education. And so this is obviously a very introductory conversation about sexual assault. I encourage you to seek out more training and information because there is a lot of information out there around this topic. And so the more you educate yourself, the more that you can sort of build skill sets within your toolbox to be able to address this issue with the folks that you are working with and in your community. And then I always go back to policies as well. I am by trade a macro social worker, so I always look at sort of the macro level policies and what that looks like. And if you are within your organization, within your school setting, whatever settings you're in, even in your own community organizations, churches, whatever it is, think about what policies are in place. If someone discloses to a staff member that they've experienced sexual assault, do people know what to do next? Do they know who to call? Do they know their mandated reporting obligations, right? So I would encourage you to seek out that information. And if you don't have those answers, challenge, those who are in those positions that create policies to create that. You want to be a place that's proactive as opposed to reactive. You don't want someone coming to disclose to you and you're trying to kind of fumble around and figure out what to do next. That unfortunately can cause more harm to an individual. And so it's always important to have something in place that a protocol that people can follow and know what to do next. So we have about 10 minutes left. I want to go, I'll take maybe 2 or 3 minutes to go through our services, and then I'll open it up if folks have any final thoughts or questions that you want to ask. So again, I'm from Avalon Healing Center. We are a nonprofit based in Detroit, but our service area is the entire county of Wayne. So we provide comprehensive services to survivors of sexual violence across different types of services, which I'll describe to you in a second. Even if a person does not live in Wayne County, they can come to us for services. The caveat to that is that they would have to engage in either virtual services or physically come into the County of Wayne to engage in services. We don't travel like outside of county to provide services to individuals. So some of our, some tidbits about us, all of our services are free and confidential. We don't take medical insurance. Those are things that we're really fortunate that we're funded pretty heftily through the state, and we have some federal funding. And so we're able to provide all of our services for free. Our services are confidential outside of mandated reporting, of course. We have 6 clinic sites in Metro Detroit, which I'll talk about in a second. Those are kind of related to our medical services. And then we do have one aspect of our programming that's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We have a crisis pager that folks can call if they've been sexually assaulted and need an immediate intervention. So we basically have 2 sides of our programming. Our medical side, so we actually have a medical staff that's trained to do what's called medical forensic exams. Common language for that is rape kits. And so most people know or have some familiarity with what a rape kit is if you've worked in this field or something related. And so our staff actually do those for all of Wayne County. And that's where our 6 clinic sites come in at. We have clinic sites in some of our local hospitals and some standalone clinics. We provide STI prevention medications, HIV prevention, Plan B, free of charge to survivors of sexual assault. We have a follow-up clinic where they can get follow-up STI testing. We do things like injury documentation if they have injury as a result. Most sexual assaults don't result in injury, contrary to popular belief, but some people just maybe are underinsured, uninsured, or maybe don't want to go to their primary care physician for this particular issue. And so they come to our follow-up clinic. And then we do education training. Our medical team does expert witness testimony. The other side of our programming is advocacy and counseling. So we do have individual and group counseling for ages 12 and up. If you're working with little ones, we do have a child advocacy center called Kids Talk that we refer individuals to that are younger than 12 years old, but otherwise they can engage in counseling services with our program. We have advocacy services, for example, legal, where we go to court with survivors, help them file police reports, file PPOs, right, so on and so forth. We do shelter and housing advocacy, things like that. Referrals to other programs. So we don't do everything in-house. For example, we don't have a shelter. And so when people are coming to us with needs that we can't fulfill, we do have community partners and relationships to be able to refer people out to other programs. We provide transportation for anything related to sexual assault. So if they have to go to follow-up medical appointments, court, meet with law enforcement, things like that, to and from counseling, we'll provide transportation. We have population-specific services. So we have youth-specific services, human trafficking, for example. So I want to end, I'll leave this on the screen for folks who are interested in my contact info. I can also share these slides with Toni to share with you all if you're interested in receiving these. But I want to take the last few minutes to open it up to questions or comments that people might have related to something I went over, or maybe there's something that I didn't discuss today that you want more information on. Feel free to unmute or enter it in the chat and I can answer that for you as well.
I have a quick question.
Yes, hi Tammy.
Hi, you were talking about how you refer out to for housing. That is a huge issue. I noticed, like, I have a really hard time getting, like I'll have them call Cam, for intake, but some of these kids, it's really hard to find places. Do you have specific places that you partner with?
We do. So we are anti-CAM because they are not the most helpful. They operate under standard business hours. Oftentimes people need shelter outside of those hours. It creates for an additional barrier. So we actually have created relationships with partners where we can bypass that process. So
Really?
so if you have, we've been really intentional about that, and our partners understand why, right? Like having someone go through the camp intake process, sometimes they're asking people to physically come in, they're sitting there all day and then they don't have anywhere to go. So
I will
yeah,
because it's like, I tell them it's 3 hours that you're on hold, and then,
it is.
we do have a contact, like once they go through it, then if there's room, like we'll call like Alternative for Girls or something, and they'll pick them up if they can.
Yeah.
So yes, no, keep going. I did not mean to interrupt you. This is
it's okay. It's okay.
beautiful information.
Yeah, so what we've done is we have gotten into formal partnerships with programs where they agree that we can refer directly to individuals. And so if you have someone that's experienced sexual assault, some of our partners house domestic violence, human trafficking, please feel free to reach out to us. Unfortunately, we can't call and say, hey, can Tammy, we would have to
exactly.
do it
I
our
go through
program,
you, but you do have partners. Okay.
Absolutely. So please take down our information, and we can definitely like assign them an advocate and have them work with them to get directly connected. But there's a caveat to that. There is a shelter shortage as well in Metro Detroit.
Oh, I know there is.
That's another issue. There's just not enough beds for the need. And so
I know.
Even though we have these relationships, like some of our like I just met
mean
2 of our partners and they're like, we're full, like we don't have any room. And so, we try to strategize around that as well. But, I think having those direct connections has helped us a lot though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Yes.
Any other questions or comments that people want to make before we close or before I hand it back over to Toni?
All
cool.
right,
well, go ahead, Toni. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Benita.
I was just going to say thank you all for spending this hour with me today and listening, and thank you all for being engaged in these educational opportunities, because again, I feel like it's super important for us to seek this knowledge out. I want to encourage you, if you have questions that come up later, feel free to reach out. If you're interested in more training, feel free to reach out. If you have an issue with someone you're working with, you're like, I don't know what to do, please reach out as well. We're here as a resource for you all. So I want to encourage you to feel free to connect with us across any of those needs that you all might have.
All right. Thank you guys for joining, and thank you so much, Benita. Excellent presentation as always. If you have any questions, reach out, let me know. I'll make connections with you so that you can connect with Avalon and Benita. And again, thank you guys for joining, and everybody have a great day.
Bye, everyone.